childhood items line the entrance of the former St. Eugene Mission Residential School, honoring the nearby discovery of 182 unmarked shallow graves.
No one was there to comfort you, things like just things that as a child I should have gotten from a loving parent, or an adult who looked after me.
It could have been my brothers, it could have been me. Couldn't have ran away. I could have drowned in a river. I was only 8 years old.
I recorded this video on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandarun peoples. So, as I am sure most of you are aware, I am Canadian, and with the news coming out, the whole world has seen the many incidents of dark discoveries across this country in the past few months. Mass unmarked graves of children who died at the hands of uncaring adults in a school system designed to eradicate any trace of their heritage, culture, and language. When I was a kid, our history classes spoke of residential schools a little. We learned they were terrible and that they were in the past tense. Well, kinda. The last school closed when I was in the 4th grade. But it was just a small lesson between the hagiography of one white colonizer and another white colonizer. As I grew up, though, I learned why it got so little attention. There's something very Canadian about masking our atrocities. We're remarkably good at looking like good guys to the international community, and we have a deep culture of denial over the horrors we've inflicted on many types of people over this country's 154-year existence. White Canadians don't often stop to think about the violence and brutality that comes with the fact that every square kilometer of this, the second largest country on Earth, was not settled or claimed, but stolen. The truth about Canada wasn't forgotten. It was hidden. And this summer, the undeniable truth came in the discovery of thousands of child corpses uncovered with ground-penetrating radar. This isn't the first time the horrors of the residential school came to light, but I hope that this will be the one white Canadians can no longer run from. And so today, we're not going to hide. It's time the sins of this country finally surface, and Canada gets the exposure it was painfully overdue for. I hope this video can be a small part of that. Hey guys. I wanted to make a donation in this video to the Indian Residential School Survivor Society, and I would say I will donate the proceeds of this video to them. However, this video is almost guaranteed to never see monetization, so I'm going to do a sponsorship break and donate the sponsorship money plus a matching amount from myself. Yeah, no gimmicks this week, no jokes. This video is brought to you by Skillshare. It's a learning community where millions come together to learn new skills such as illustration, design, freelancing, photography, and more. It's a harsh world out there. And in the coming gig economy dystopia, having something like Skillshare to help pivot and make yourself more marketable is a way to get ahead without expensive tuition fees. The most recent class I took was Storytelling Through Film, How to Create Engaging Video for YouTube by Thomas Danger. It was packed with helpful information, and in only a 20-minute course, I completely changed how to structure my videos to make them a little more engaging. If you want to give it a try yourself, I got something here for you. The link in the description will provide the first 1,000 people who use it a free month of Skillshare's premium service. So you've got nothing to lose there. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video. It really means a lot to me. Welcome to Step Back, the feel-bad hit of the summer. The relationship between Canada and the Indigenous peoples of this land is not dissimilar from that of the US. For about 150 years, the Indigenous people of this country went from being a rich tapestry of independent, self-governing nations to wards of the state, for lack of a better term, under brutal suppression. While initially there was some degree of cooperation, exploitative as it was ultimately, this changed drastically in the early years of the 19th century. The Indigenous people had land, and French and English settlers wanted to acquire more and more territory because, infinite growth and whatnot. The British government running Canada at the time appeared cooperative, signing peace treaties on a nation-and-nation basis. However, they immediately turned around and set policy as if they did no such thing. Because of that, these treaties tended to be worth about as much as the paper they were printed on, and often those writing the treaties would exploit language barriers to make raw deals anyway. Many of these treaties still stand to this day, unfulfilled. Unfortunately, the Canadian state still chooses to violate them, like in British Columbia, where the Canadian state sent in federal police to forcibly remove the Wet'suwet'en people from their land, never ceded, by the way, so that they could build an oil pipeline through it. Saying nice stuff while committing racist atrocities is quite par for the course in Canada, by the way. The policies put in place were quite explicit in their aims. They intended to dispossess Indigenous people of their land and forcibly assimilate them into Western culture. An approach that continued all the way until, well, you'll see later in this video that it doesn't really end per se. Even in the cooperative times, we saw the seeds of what would become the residential school system in attempts to assimilate and westernize Indigenous people as far back as the 17th century, when what would become Quebec was a kind of backwater French colony called New France, notably only because my ancestors lived there. Catholic missionaries like the Recollets, the Jesuits, and the Ursulines tried to start Catholic day schools to convert the Indigenous people nearby. Still, they, by and large, resisted the effort. Not wanting to sour the peaceful relations with the locals, political instability, and church resources being needed elsewhere led to this experiment in assimilation to be over by the end of the 1600s. Religious projects like this then largely fell by the wayside for a little over a century. Due to the 7 Years' War, that French colony was now English. And because of the American Revolution, many more English-speaking people lived in the colony, which would become Canada. This time, it was Anglican missions, but again, these were short-term projects, really just experiments with limited success and longevity. Then, Canada's military targets began to change. A lot of Canada's focus in its early years was defending itself against the potential of American invasion. Canadians were, after all, made up of loyalists from the American Revolution and represented the British colonies that did not choose to leave. After the War of 1812, however, this tension ended. America no longer saw Canada as future American states waiting for liberation. Canada didn't see the US as a potential invader, so we turned our sights on Indigenous nations, which we no longer needed to rely on as allies in a potential war against the United States. This was when Canada turned over working with Indigenous people from the military, who were interested chiefly in good relations, to civilian colonial governments interested in permanent colonization. Because they wanted to grow the country, they were more interested in assimilating and dispossessing the Indigenous people. The real beginning of the contiguous residential school system began with the Mohawk Institute Residential School, founding in Six Nations on Grand River, a reserve near Brantford, Ontario in the early 19th century. This ominous keystone of the residential school system would stay in operation until 1970. The structure of what would become the residential school system came from several foundational reports and recommendations. A colonial administrator named Sir Charles Bagot wrote a 1845 document outlining what the federal residential school system would look like. He worked closely with the Superintendent of Education for Upper Canada, Egerton Ryerson. He did so by studying industrial schools in other parts of the British Empire. An 1847 report by Ryerson for the Assistant Superintendent General of Indian Affairs also built this institution. His recommendations were for education and religious instructions as the best model for what to do with the Indigenous people, concluding that they were too culturally inferior to educate themselves. His proposals focused on agriculture and turned a smattering of schools built by various Christian churches into something government-funded. His report would come to define how this system worked. And oh, what do you know? Egerton Ryerson is still the namesake of Ryerson University. Here's some pictures of some statues of him getting f***ed up. I don't know, maybe we should do something about this university holding this guy's name? These reports and proposals eventually formalized in a series of laws designed to force Indigenous people through the residential school system into being either English or French speakers, to make them Christian, and to make them farmers. The eventual idea was to use this education to completely destroy their culture and eradicate any trace of their religion from ever existing. Canada is a remarkably decentralized country compared to others, but still, the British North America Act, which gave Canada independence, included Indigenous affairs under the federal government's jurisdiction, which stands until today. The 1876 Indian Act formalized this and brought a myriad of treaties, agreements, and laws under one federal jurisdiction, making Indigenous people officially wards of the state. It forced them under Canadian subjugation, but without the right to vote or to join the professions without surrendering their status. For the nuts and bolts of the residential school system, the first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, wanted to viciously pursue the best way to eradicate Indigenous culture. He commissioned a report to study the United States' residential schools to essentially crib off them. They took a lot of their system from President Ulysses S. Grant's assimilation program, which included a network of schools funded by the federal government in collaboration with the church. One of the baby Canadian government's first missions as a country was a bold program of cultural genocide, building these schools across the country. By the 1920s, the government was even buying them off of churches, funding the schools' operations, and letting the churches staff them. The schools themselves were severely underfunded, and teachers very underpaid. Many of the schools relied on forced labor from the students to even stay afloat. Later on, the government would completely take over the residential schools. This is why you've probably seen a circle of blame throwing between our government and the church, especially the Catholic Church, which by far ran the most schools of all denominations. The conditions of these schools were, to say the least, horrific, both through official policy and through terrible neglect and near non-existent oversight. Kids taken to this facility had their hair cut. They were forced to dress in Western style and take European names. Any expression of their Indigenous language or religion would be punished harshly by withholding food and corporal punishment. The forced labor they relied on, as I mentioned earlier, began to take up so much of the time that the children received very little actual education. And there was rampant abuse. As more and more testimonies of the experiences of residential school survivors come to light, we learned that there was widespread physical and sexual assault committed by school administrators. The schools themselves had inadequate heating, were overcrowded, had poor ventilation, bad sewage systems, and lacked both food and medical care. Diseases like influenza, and especially tuberculosis, spread like wildfire in these schools, with death rates as high as 69%. Despite warnings from medical experts, the schools never made any changes to help with this disease. They even tried to prevent research and the publishing of existing research about tuberculosis at residential schools. These various abuses caused children to die in huge numbers. Coming to light now, at least to the white majority, the number of dead is likely in the tens of thousands. Parents asking about their children were often told the kids ran away as they lay in an unmarked grave on school grounds. And nutrition scientists did medical experiments on these children. Yep. This was around the time we were figuring out vitamins and minerals, so they decided that residential school children made great test subjects, which included creating control groups where they intentionally undernourished children. Indigenous people tried hard to fight these schools. Parents would hide their children from the government just so they wouldn't be taken away and sent there. Students often sabotaged the schools, stole supplies, or even ran away. On at least 25 occasions, the students set fire to the schools as a form of protest. It says quite a bit when you see students cheering the burning down of their school. So, if residential schools were so bad, why wasn't anything said about it, some big brain commenter might ask? Well, it was. Multiple times. In 1907, a doctor named Peter Bryce wrote a damning report on the conditions of the residential schools in the prairies. It wasn't until 1922 that he was allowed to publish a landmark study called The Story of a National Crime. He pointed out kids were dying in droves and that the government wasn't doing anything to fight it. It was irrefutable, and the government could not pretend that they didn't know what was happening. so they kept the schools open for a further 74 years. In 1966, an Ojibwe child named Channy Wenjack tried to escape the horrors of the residential school he attended in Kenora, Ontario. He walked for 36 hours in sub-zero temperatures with only a light windbreaker, until eventually he tragically died of exposure. His death sparked an inquest into the abuses endured by these victims of the residential schools. A further article about his death by prominent Canadian magazine Maclean's brought national attention down to the plight of these children. And in 1990, a high-profile Indigenous leader in Manitoba named Phil Fontaine went public about the abuses he endured when he attended the residential school system as a child. By the 1940s, it became pretty obvious what a disaster the residential schools had become. So much of a disaster that they lasted another 50 years. But by 1969, the schools were taken over by the Department of Indian Affairs and away from the churches. The government's plan was to eventually phase out these schools. But still, the Catholic Church protested, claiming that segregated schools were the best approach for Indigenous children. Oddly, though, even some Indigenous communities opposed their closing, preferring that they instead be turned over to their control. By 1986, most of the residential schools were closed. There was a 1996 Royal Commission into the schools. By 1997, the last residential school in the Arctic territory of Nunavut closed. But the decline of the residential schools did not mean an end to the project to forcibly strip Indigenous children of their culture. One way Canada did so began with what's called the 60s scoop. Indigenous children were taken away in huge numbers from their families and bands and adopted into white middle-class families across Canada and the United States. These children grew up without any connection to their nation or culture, essentially severing them from their people. It's called the 60s scoop because of an article published about it at the time. Still, this process started as early as the 1950s and lasted until the 1980s, when child welfare programs were seriously amended. Now, this sort of foster care system tries to keep children within their family or nation if possible. That being said, it's still reported to be a problem. Under this regime, it's suspected over 20,000 Indigenous children were adopted to mostly non-Indigenous homes. As you can imagine, the trauma inflicted upon the students of the residential school system has profoundly impacted those lucky enough to survive. Many survivors experience severe mental scars, including many signs of PTSD, night terrors, depression, suicide, and substance abuse. The severing from their culture left them feeling listless and detached from their own families. They often had lost their first language and had trouble even talking to their kin. In addition, the schools instilled a sense of shame and guilt for who they were, and the lingering trauma of these residential schools passed down from generation to generation. One study found this linked to a distinct sense of cultural disruption and a collective memory of powerlessness and loss. This pall over these nations has been invoked to explain the high prevalence of sexual abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic violence, mental illness, and suicide among Indigenous communities. One sample of 127 survivors revealed that half have criminal records. Then again, Indigenous people are incarcerated at a very disproportional rate in Canada compared to their proportion of the population. In addition, 65% have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. 21% have been diagnosed with major depression. 7% have been diagnosed with anxiety disorder, and 7% have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. This is what happens when you abuse and traumatize several generations. The 1996 Royal Commission recommended an action-based reconciliation. Many of the churches involved had attempted reconciliation plans starting as early as the mid-1970s. In 1998, the federal government apologized for those who were abused at the schools. It also created the Aboriginal Healing Foundation to invest in multiple projects to heal the damage done by the schools. That is, until the Canadian government, under Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, abruptly cut its funding in 2010. Throughout the first decade of the 21st century, we started to make steps towards doing some form of reparations for those who survived. In 2005, the federal government announced a $1.9 billion compensation package for survivors. It also led to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, which is the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. In 2008, the government started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This massive program traveled across Canada, collecting over 7,000 testimonies of those who survived the schools. From 2008 to 15, it compiled a multi-thousand-page document detailing the true scope of the horrors that occurred there. And it came to the conclusion that what Canada did amounted to cultural genocide, the intentional work to destroy a people culturally, nationally, and spiritually. Furthermore, it made over 90 recommendations to the Canadian government and society to emphasize what happened and actively work towards reconciliation. As a result, several universities have added compulsory Native Studies courses, but this has been a slow and sluggish process for our colonizer society. The Government of Canada also officially apologized in 2008 for the schools in general, and several Canadian provinces followed suit. Though don't give the Conservatives too much credit for doing this. They had to be pressured into it pretty hard. Many church organizations have also apologized, though notably the Pope has not. Neither Benedict XVI nor Pope Francis have mustered anything beyond sorrow for what happened. And because one of the fun aspects of how settler institutions have reacted to this, they're shifting blame onto each other. The government tries to emphasize the role of the churches. The Catholic Church, at least, seems to want to blame the government, though some clergy have actually broke rank to apologize anyway. The only people who bit the bullet and owned up to their sins were the United Church and the Anglican churches, and even then, that was just our rogue-based Canadian Anglican Church. The head of the real Anglican Church, the Queen, hasn't been bothered to apologize as of the writing of this video. Even the Stephen Harper apology in 2008 intentionally excluded the residential schools in Newfoundland and Labrador, as it only joined Canada in 1949. So a lot of the reparations given to victims of the residential school system excluded Newfoundlanders. By the time a class action suit eventually gave the over 1,000 plaintiffs some form of compensation, only about 900 were still alive to receive it. And so, with this period of reckoning now 6 years ago, how much has changed? Has Canada really taken its call to build a nation-to-nation bridge of trust and reconciliation? No, of course not. We went the last few years trying to build oil pipelines to their territory and keep many reserves on boil water advisories. Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, in a very Justin Trudeau and the Liberals way, is saying nice language while currently in a legal battle against the people separated from their families in the child welfare system I mentioned earlier. Oh, and the genocide hasn't stopped, as we have reports of Indigenous women undergoing forced sterilization. Much of the residential school system's architects, the monsters who laid out an explicit program to eradicate Indigenous culture from the earth, are revered as heroes and fathers of Confederation. The country is lousy with statues of the Queen and John A. Macdonald. Yet Ryerson University still had its name, despite all we know about the actions of Egerton Ryerson. And there's a strong current of racist denial of the extent of the horrors of these schools, or worse, people who have praise for them. In 2017, Conservative Senator Lynn Bayek had to be removed from a Senate committee on Aboriginal peoples. She complained that we weren't acknowledging all the good the schools did. After her removal, she complained about freedom of speech shit, because obviously. She stayed a senator until January of this year. A pastor just last month came under fire for his comments about the good done by these engines of abuse and death. And honestly, the overwhelming response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the apology, the dark legacy of unspeakable things we did to children in the name of erasing their very identity, was indifference. Settler Canadians just didn't seem to care. But then Kamloops happened. On May 28th of 2021, the bodies of 215 children were found in an unmarked mass grave on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops, British Columbia. 104 more were located soon after in Brandon, Manitoba. 751 were found in Maryville, Saskatchewan. 182 in Cranbrook, BC, and 160 on Cooper Island, BC. More are being discovered every day, and a lot of more investigations are getting started. It's increased the estimated dead from residential schools by a lot. For the first time, the international community became aware of Canada's sins. The response was more than I expected, to be honest. Statues fell. Churches were set ablaze. Canada Day, our national holiday, and the first time that we're celebrating it after the mass vaccination campaign for COVID, was canceled in cities across the country. Instead of wearing red, we wore orange, a symbol for the victims of the residential schools. Orange was chosen because of the story of Phyllis Jack Webstead. She's a residential school survivor who had her favorite orange shirt given to her by her grandmother, forcibly stripped from her by the school, and never returned. And finally this year, after seeming like a long shot for so long, these dark discoveries pushed forth a bill to make September 30th Orange Shirt Day in Canada, a stat holiday of truth and reconciliation. September was chosen because it was the time of year children were taken away from their parents to go to the residential schools. But this is not all time for optimism. The media seems keen on moving on from this story. Canadians love to bury their sins deep so that they can face the world with typical Canadian smug superiority. But maybe you're incited to action. Maybe this reckoning we're having would make a settler Canadian like myself try to find a way to help. You can get involved in multiple ways, but to learn how, I'm going to give the camera over to Lance from the Surfs. He knows a lot more about it than I do, and he'll be able to help you out.
So now at this point, you're probably wondering, how can you help? And if you want to tackle this from a material standpoint, there's a lot of great organizations you can donate money or time to. I would personally recommend the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. They run a 24-hour support line that helps people in need, especially during this crisis. Also, if you're interested in wearing an orange shirt in solidarity, and it's awesome. I mean, this year at the Canada Day Festival, or the Un-Canada Day Festival that took place in Canada, I saw more orange shirts than I did red ones. So that was very refreshing to see for sure. If you want to do that, though, please buy an orange shirt from an Indigenous orange shirt creator, designer, or printer. There seems to be a lot of people who are taking this into their own hands to profit off, which is just really, really ghoulish. I mean, you wouldn't try to make merchandise off the Holocaust or anything like that. So shame on companies like Staples. And anyone who, again, wants to do that, please visit and check out links from Indigenous shirt creators. One of the most important things you can honestly do, though, is to spread this information and to educate others about it. This is a huge shortcoming when it comes to the Canadian education system, let alone the world. This reckoning, if you want to call it, of discovering all these unmarked graves of children is helping put this into focus for the first time. However, this is not new news, especially to Indigenous communities who have known about this tragedy for generations now. You can become more active within Indigenous communities themselves. There's a lot of organizations that you can reach out to, especially ones that need a lot of volunteers at this time. There's a lot of great organizations. Links will be provided in the description below. And finally, just please listen. One of the biggest things is that a lot of people, especially either white passing people like myself or just people who aren't Indigenous at all, seem to really want to take this into their own hands and turn this into their cause du jour. And that's completely fine. And it really helps when allies come forward to bring attention to this news. However, the most important thing to do right now is to really listen to Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders, elders, bands, but most importantly, survivors. Listen to their stories, let them have their time, amplify their voices if you can, because that's one of the most important things you can do.
And then we can talk about the Land Back movement, an effort to truly decolonize Canada. It involves simple things like Canada actually honoring the treaties it made with Indigenous nations. We would also treat Indigenous people as the wardens of the land and would be included in decision-making about land and resource use. These nations had no intention of ceding ground to the settler state, and we should approach reconciliation knowing that. We live on stolen ground, and we should appreciate that. Reconciliation and decolonization should be at the core of Canadian identity. The longer we live in denial of the atrocities we committed, the longer we will know a continent without peace. Equality for everyone in this land requires decolonization to move forward in recognition and remembrance for what was lost. So please, never forget the kids. Never forget these schools. Let's build a new relationship on reconciliation. And if we do that, who knows what we could become?